My husband kissed me goodbye that Monday morning, smiled like he always did, and told me he would be in Chicago for 3 days on business. For hours later, I walked into the same hotel lobby and watched him check in with another woman. I used to believe that trust disappeared all at once, like a window shattering from a single stone. I know better now. Trust fades quietly, one tiny crack at a time, until one ordinary moment finally reveals what has been broken for years. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I was 64 years old when my marriage ended without a single argument. It happened in the polished marble lobby of the Grand Lakeshore Hotel in downtown Chicago. I hadn't planned to be there. Every spring, the charitable foundation where I volunteered hosted a leadership conference in different cities across the country. That year Chicago had been chosen. Thomas barely looked up from his coffee when I told him about the trip 2 weeks earlier. He simply nodded and said he would already be there for meetings with a manufacturing client. "Looks like we'll just miss each other," he had said with a smile. I remember thinking how unfortunate the timing was. After 40 years of marriage, even one extra dinner together during a business trip felt like a small gift. Monday morning arrived with soft rain tapping against our kitchen windows in Seattle. Thomas rolled his suitcase to the front door, adjusted his navy blazer, kissed my forehead and promised he would call every evening. Nothing about his voice sounded different. Nothing about his expression warned me that I was watching a carefully rehearsed performance. I hugged him goodbye and wished him safe travels. Then I finished watering my garden before heading to the airport for my own afternoon flight. By the time my taxi stopped outside the Grand Lakeshore Hotel, the rain had turned into a gentle drizzle. Bellhops moved briskly beneath large black umbrellas, while business travelers hurried across the sidewalk with rolling luggage clicking over the pavement. Inside, the lobby smelled of polished wood, fresh flowers and expensive coffee. Warm lighting reflected across the marble floors, giving the entire room an inviting glow. I stepped through the revolving door, adjusted the strap of my handbag, and paused for a moment to admire the elegant chandelier hanging above the reception desk. That was when I saw him. Thomas stood less than 50 feet away. He wasn't alone. A woman with shoulder-length blonde hair stood beside him, smiling as she lightly rested her hand on his arm while they waited to check in. She looked younger than me by at least 20 years, dressed in a cream-colored coat with a leather carry-on resting beside her suitcase. They weren't behaving like co-workers waiting between meetings. They looked comfortable together, familiar, relaxed. The hotel clerk handed Thomas 2 key cards. He accepted both without hesitation before passing one directly to the woman. She thanked him with an easy smile, and together they walked toward the elevators as naturally as any couple beginning a quiet vacation. My first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't heartbreak. It was disbelief. I actually wondered whether I was looking at someone who simply resembled my husband. Then Thomas laughed. I had heard that laugh for 4 decades. There was no mistake. My hands remained perfectly still. My breathing never changed. I didn't call his name. I didn't chase after him. I simply stepped behind a large arrangement of white lilies until the elevator doors closed and the numbers climbed upward. Only then did I quietly walk to the reception desk. "Good afternoon," I said with the calmest voice I could manage. "I'd like to reserve a room for 3 nights. As the receptionist typed on her keyboard, I removed my wedding ring and slipped it gently into the small zippered pocket inside my purse. Not because I had stopped loving the man I married, but because I suddenly understood that the marriage I believed I still had no longer existed. And as I accepted my room key with a polite smile, I made one silent promise to myself. Thomas Hayes would decide when to tell me the truth, but he would never decide whether I discovered it first. I spent the next 15 minutes in my room standing beside the window without opening my suitcase. From the 21st floor, Chicago looked exactly as I had imagined it would: busy streets below, rows of taxis weaving through afternoon traffic, and the distant shoreline of Lake Michigan disappearing beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Everything outside continued exactly as it should, while inside my mind every memory from the last several years quietly rearranged itself into something I no longer recognized. I finally sat on the edge of the bed and reached for my phone. There were 2 unread messages from Thomas. The first had been sent before his flight supposedly landed. It simply read, "Boarding now. Love you." The second arrived less than 30 minutes earlier. "Just got to the client office. Long afternoon ahead. I stared at those words for a long time. He had sent them while I was watching him collect 2 room keys beside another woman. I did not reply. Instead, I locked my phone and slipped it into my purse. That silence felt unfamiliar. For 40 years I had answered every message, returned every call, and believed every explanation because trust had become part of my daily routine. For the first time in my marriage, I decided that saying nothing was more powerful than asking questions I already knew he would answer with another lie. An hour later I walked downstairs to the hotel cafe overlooking the lobby. I ordered a cup of black coffee that slowly grew cold in front of me because I barely touched it. From where I sat, I could see the elevators, the reception desk, and the revolving entrance doors without attracting attention. Business travelers arrived carrying briefcases, families checked in with excited children, and couples wandered through the lobby discussing dinner plans. Every ordinary conversation around me made my own situation feel strangely unreal. Shortly after 5 o'clock, the elevator doors opened and Thomas stepped into the lobby wearing a different jacket than the one he had left home in that morning. Claire walked beside him, smiling as they spoke quietly about something that made them both laugh. I could not hear their conversation, but I noticed how naturally they matched each other's pace. There was no awkwardness between them, no hesitation, no careful distance that co-workers usually kept in public. They looked comfortable because they had done this before. They crossed the lobby together and left through the front entrance without ever looking in my direction. I waited another 10 minutes before following them outside. They walked several storefronts down the block before entering a small Italian restaurant with warm lights glowing behind its windows. I remained across the street, pretending to study a city map while watching through the glass. They shared a quiet dinner, leaning toward each other as they talked. Once in a while Claire smiled warmly, and Thomas returned the expression with a familiarity that hurt far more than anger ever could. There were no dramatic gestures, no public displays that would shock strangers passing by. What I saw instead was something much harder to accept. They looked like 2 people who had built comfortable routines together. After nearly 90 minutes they left the restaurant carrying takeaway coffee cups and disappeared into the evening crowd. I returned to the hotel slowly, each step strangely steady despite everything unfolding around me. Back in my room I opened my laptop, not to search for excuses but to remember facts. I created a simple document and typed the date, the time, the hotel name, the restaurant, and every detail I could still recall while it remained fresh in my memory. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of clarity. Too often people convince themselves that painful memories become distorted over time. I wanted every observation preserved exactly as it happened. At 9:30 that evening my phone rang. Thomas's name appeared on the screen beside the smiling photograph I had taken of him during our anniversary trip to Napa Valley 5 years earlier. I answered after the 3rd ring. His voice sounded relaxed. He apologized for being busy all day and described meetings that had never taken place. I listened quietly without interrupting once. Before hanging up, he said he missed me and hoped my conference was going well. I smiled even though he could not see me. "Everything is going just fine," I replied honestly, because at that very moment I had finally stopped searching for the truth. I had already found it. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest. The city outside my window was still quiet, with only a few headlights cutting through the pale blue light of dawn. I made myself a cup of coffee using the small machine in the room, and stood there watching steam rise from the paper cup. 40 years of marriage deserved more than impulsive decisions. If I was going to face the truth, I wanted to understand how long it had been living beside me without my noticing. My conference sessions began at 8:30, and I attended each one exactly as I had planned months before. I greeted colleagues, took notes, and participated in discussions as though nothing in my personal life had changed. More than once someone commented that I looked unusually calm. I thanked them with a polite smile. They could not possibly know that calmness and shock sometimes wear the same face. During the lunch break I found myself remembering moments that had seemed completely ordinary when they happened. About 3 years earlier Thomas had started taking more business trips than ever before. At first I admired his dedication. He often said the company needed experienced leadership to maintain important client relationships. I never questioned him because I had always believed that supporting one another meant trusting without constant suspicion. Then came the little changes. He began protecting his phone with a new password after decades of leaving it on the kitchen counter without a second thought. He purchased an expensive travel suitcase even though his old one was still in excellent condition. Weekend meetings became more frequent, and whenever I suggested joining him for dinner after one of his conferences, he gently explained that clients preferred private discussions. Every explanation had sounded reasonable on its own. Looking back, I realized they had formed a pattern I simply never wanted to see. There were holidays when he seemed distracted, birthdays when he checked electronic mail more often than he watched our grandchildren open presents, and quiet evenings when I caught him smiling at messages before quickly locking his screen. I had always chosen the kindest interpretation because love encourages hope, even when hope quietly ignores obvious signs. After the conference ended that afternoon, I walked several blocks through downtown Chicago without any destination in mind. The cool breeze coming off the lake carried the familiar scent of rain, and office workers hurried past me with briefcases and umbrellas while tourists paused to photograph the skyline. Life moved forward for everyone else, reminding me that my own future would eventually move forward as well. The question was no longer whether Thomas had been dishonest. The question had become how completely he had rewritten the life we were supposed to be sharing. Back at the hotel, I stopped near the concierge desk where an older gentleman wearing a silver name badge welcomed guests with quiet professionalism. We exchanged a few pleasant words about the weather before he casually asked whether I had stayed with the hotel before. I told him it was my first visit. He smiled warmly and replied that many guests returned year after year because they felt almost at home there. His comments settled heavily in my thoughts. I could not explain why, but something about the way he said it made me wonder whether this place felt familiar to Thomas for reasons that had nothing to do with business. That evening I sat once again in the cafe overlooking the lobby, not because I hoped to change what I had already seen, but because every passing hour seemed to confirm that the man I married had been living two separate lives. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, I found myself asking a different question. I no longer wondered who Claire Bennett was. I wondered how many people already knew the truth except me. The following morning I decided to stop relying on assumptions and start paying attention to details. I arrived in the lobby earlier than usual and settled into the same corner of the cafe with a newspaper folded neatly beside my untouched breakfast. I was no longer there as a wife hoping to be proven wrong. I was there as someone quietly observing a reality that had existed long before I happened to witness it. At a little after 8 o'clock, Thomas and Claire stepped out of the elevator together. They were dressed for what anyone would assume was a normal business day. Thomas carried his leather briefcase while Claire held a slim laptop bag over her shoulder. They exchanged a few quiet words, smiled, and walked toward the front entrance. Before they reached the revolving door, Thomas lightly touched the small of her back, guiding her around another guest with effortless familiarity. It was such an ordinary gesture that most people would never have noticed it. I did. You cannot spend 40 years married to someone without recognizing the small habits that belong only to them. That simple movement had once been reserved for me. After they left, I remained in my seat for another hour, slowly finishing my coffee while reviewing every note I had written since arriving in Chicago. Dates, times, places, conversations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just facts. I had learned over the years that facts remain calm, even when emotions do not. Around mid-morning I approached the concierge desk again. The gentleman I had spoken with the previous afternoon greeted me with the same welcoming smile. We chatted briefly about museums and restaurants before I casually mentioned that my husband had recommended the hotel because he claimed to have stayed there during several business trips. The concierge nodded almost immediately. "We have many loyal guests who return throughout the year," he said pleasantly. "People appreciate seeing familiar faces." It was an innocent comment, yet something about his expression suggested recognition. He looked toward the elevators for a brief second before returning his attention to me. "Consistency makes people feel comfortable," he added. I thanked him for the sightseeing suggestions and walked away without asking another question. His words echoed in my mind. Familiar faces. Returning throughout the year. Comfortable. They were ordinary phrases, but together they painted a picture I had not wanted to imagine. That afternoon my conference concluded earlier than expected, leaving several free hours before dinner. Instead of exploring the city, I returned to the hotel lounge where business travelers often gathered between meetings. From my seat near the fireplace, I watched employees greet certain guests by name. When Thomas entered a little after 5 o'clock, one of the bartenders smiled warmly and welcomed him back. Thomas responded with the relaxed confidence of someone who had heard those words many times before. Claire joined him a few minutes later, and without needing to ask, the bartender prepared 2 drinks exactly as they preferred. No menus. No hesitation. Familiarity cannot be rehearsed overnight. It grows over repeated visits, quiet conversations, and routines established over time. I suddenly understood that I had not stumbled upon the beginning of their story. I had walked into the middle of one that had likely been unfolding for years. I returned to my room carrying nothing except that realization. As evening settled over the city, my phone vibrated with another message from Thomas telling me his meetings had run late and that he was exhausted. He hoped I had enjoyed networking with colleagues and said he could not wait to come home. I read every word carefully before placing the phone on the nightstand. The sadness I felt was no longer sharp. It had become something quieter and far more dangerous. Certainty. Once certainty settles into your heart, hope no longer argues with it. It simply steps aside and allows you to see everything exactly as it is. The final morning of my conference arrived with bright sunshine spilling across the city, making Chicago look warmer than it had all week. I packed my suitcase carefully but left it by the door. My flight back to Seattle would not leave until early evening, and I had one quiet decision left to make. I was no longer interested in discovering whether Thomas cared about Claire. That answer had become painfully obvious. What I needed to understand was whether this hidden life reached beyond stolen days together. During one of the conference networking sessions, I found myself speaking with an attorney from Minneapolis who specialized in nonprofit governance. We spent nearly an hour discussing volunteer organizations, financial accountability, and the importance of keeping accurate records. The conversation was completely unrelated to my marriage, yet one sentence remained with me after we shook hands. He smiled and said, "Whenever something feels wrong, documents usually tell the story better than emotions." I carried those words with me as I returned to the hotel. That afternoon I sat quietly in the business center using one of the guest computers to review publicly available information. I searched Thomas's company website, recent corporate announcements, and business directories. His travel schedule certainly existed, but several dates that he had described as mandatory conferences produced no public record at all. A few industry events had never even taken place. I was careful not to jump to conclusions. Missing information was not proof. Still, each unanswered question seemed to fit neatly beside everything else I had witnessed over the previous 3 days. Before leaving for the airport, I walked through the lobby one last time. The concierge noticed me and wished me a safe flight home. We exchanged a few pleasant words before he said something that caught my attention. "We hope to welcome you back again soon." I smiled politely. "Perhaps someday," I answered. Then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "Maybe next time both of you can stay a little longer." He immediately continued helping another guest, unaware that his simple remark had settled heavily in my thoughts. "Both of you." He believed Thomas and I had visited together before. Or perhaps he assumed every married couple traveled as one. I could not know which was true, and I did not ask him to explain. Some questions are better answered through patience than impulse. My flight home was quiet. As the airplane crossed the clouds, I looked out the window and remembered vacations Thomas and I had taken over 4 decades. We had celebrated anniversaries in Napa Valley, watched autumn leaves in Vermont, and spent countless weekends driving along the Oregon coast. Those memories were still real. They did not disappear simply because later choices had changed our future. But I also understood that beautiful memories cannot protect a marriage from present dishonesty. When I unlocked the front door that evening, the house looked exactly as I had left it. The familiar scent of cedar from the hallway cabinet greeted me, and family photographs still lined the walls. Everything appeared unchanged, yet I no longer felt like the same woman who had packed her suitcase only a few days earlier. Around 8 o'clock Thomas called to say his final meeting had gone well, and that he would return home the following afternoon. His voice sounded relaxed, confident, and completely unaware that anything had shifted between us. I listened patiently as he described another imaginary dinner with clients and another productive business session. When the call ended, I walked into our home office, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote today's date across the top of the first page. Beneath it, I added a single sentence. From this moment forward, I will trust evidence more than explanations. It was not the beginning of revenge. It was the beginning of reclaiming my own judgment, one careful step at a time. Thomas returned home on Friday afternoon carrying a small gift bag from the airport, just as he had after so many previous business trips. Inside was a box of chocolate-covered almonds and a refrigerator magnet featuring the Chicago skyline. He smiled as he handed them to me, saying he knew I enjoyed collecting magnets from places we had visited together over the years. I thanked him warmly and placed both items on the kitchen counter without opening the chocolates. Then I asked whether he wanted coffee before dinner. He answered yes, kissed my cheek, and disappeared upstairs to unpack. Watching him move comfortably through our home was strangely unsettling. Nothing in his expression suggested guilt. Nothing hinted that he believed his carefully constructed routine had been interrupted. He behaved exactly as he always had, and perhaps that was what troubled me most. People often imagine that deception looks dramatic. In reality, it can appear perfectly ordinary. Over the following week, I resumed my normal schedule. I volunteered at the community center on Tuesday, attended my book club on Wednesday, and met my sister for lunch on Thursday. If anyone had looked at my calendar, they would have seen the life of a woman whose world remained perfectly intact. Only I knew that every ordinary day now included quiet observation. Thomas continued mentioning future trips, client dinners, and conferences with the same effortless confidence. I stopped asking questions because his answers no longer mattered. Instead, I listened carefully, making simple notes after each conversation. Dates, destinations, flight numbers when he happened to mention them. They were not accusations. They were records. One Monday afternoon, while organizing paperwork in our home office, I realized how much of our financial life had always depended on trust. We had shared accounts for decades, paid bills together, and discussed retirement plans openly. I decided it was finally time to understand every document carrying both our names. I requested copies of recent account statements, reviewed property records, and organized insurance policies into clearly labeled folders. Nothing about those actions felt secretive. They were responsibilities I should have taken more seriously years earlier. As I sorted through everything, I noticed several recurring charges from an airline rewards program Thomas rarely mentioned. There were also hotel loyalty points accumulating much faster than I had expected from the handful of business trips he usually described. By themselves, neither detail proved wrongdoing. Together, they suggested a travel pattern larger than the one I had been told about. Rather than confronting him, I scheduled an appointment with a family law attorney recommended by a longtime friend from my volunteer organization. The meeting took place in a quiet office overlooking Elliott Bay. The attorney, Patricia Monroe, greeted me with kindness rather than curiosity. She never pressured me toward immediate decisions. Instead, she listened carefully while I explained only what I knew firsthand and separated it from what I merely suspected. When I finished speaking, she folded her hands across the desk and said something I would never forget. Good decisions are rarely made in the loudest moments of our lives. Give yourself the gift of preparation before you give anyone an answer. Those words settled my thoughts more than any reassurance could have. I left her office carrying a slim folder outlining practical steps for protecting my financial interests, gathering documentation, and planning carefully before taking further action. Driving home along the waterfront, I realized I no longer felt trapped by uncertainty. I had not yet decided what my marriage's future would be, but I had chosen how I would face whatever came next. When I pulled into our driveway that evening, Thomas was trimming the rose bushes near the front porch, smiling as though nothing in our lives had changed. I smiled back with the same calm expression, knowing that while he still believed he was directing the story of our marriage, I had quietly begun writing the next chapter myself. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm so ordinary that anyone looking from the outside would have believed our marriage was as steady as ever. Thomas continued leaving for work each morning with the same briefcase, the same travel mug filled with black coffee, and the same cheerful promise that he would not be home too late. Every evening we shared dinner at the same oak table where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and countless family holidays over 4 decades. We discuss grocery lists, neighborhood news, and the latest baseball scores. If there was one difference, it existed only inside me. I no longer listened to his stories as a trusting wife. I listened as someone separating facts from carefully polished fiction. About 2 weeks after our return from Chicago, Thomas announced another business trip, this time to Denver. He explained that an important client wanted to finalize a long-term contract, and that he would only be gone for 2 nights. I smiled, asked whether he had packed a warm jacket because the evenings could still be chilly, and reminded him to call once he arrived. My words sounded exactly like they always had. He thanked me, kissed my forehead, and drove away before sunrise the following Monday. An hour after he left, I opened the notebook that had slowly become my quiet companion. I wrote down the destination, the dates, and the flight number he had mentioned over breakfast. Later that afternoon, I received a short message saying he had landed safely and was heading directly into meetings. I wished him luck and placed my phone face down on the kitchen table. There was no anger in that moment, only patience. The next morning, I met Patricia Monroe again. This time our conversation focused entirely on preparation rather than emotion. She reviewed the financial records I had organized, explained how shared assets were documented under Washington law, and encouraged me to continue gathering information without making assumptions. She reminded me that important decisions should always rest on verified facts instead of suspicion alone. Her calm professionalism gave me confidence. I realized that strength does not always arrive as courage. Sometimes it arrives as careful organization. After leaving her office, I stopped by my bank and opened an individual checking account in my own name. I transferred only the small amount Patricia had advised me was appropriate from my personal earnings and volunteer reimbursement funds. Everything was documented properly. Nothing was hidden. It was simply one more practical step toward standing on my own feet, whatever the future might hold. That evening Thomas called while I was watering the roses in our backyard. He sounded relaxed and told me dinner with his clients had gone exceptionally well. I could hear quiet restaurant music in the background along with the soft clinking of dishes. He laughed about a funny story one of the executives had shared and promised he would bring home a local specialty bakery dessert the following evening. His performance was polished, almost effortless. When the call ended, I remained outside watching the last light fade behind the cedar trees. I thought about the woman I had been only a month earlier. She would have accepted every word without hesitation. The woman standing in that garden now understood something entirely different. Trust should never require someone to ignore their own judgment. As I closed my notebook before going to bed, I noticed how much it had changed since the first page. It no longer contained only dates and observations. It contained clarity. Piece by piece, the confusion that had followed me home from Chicago had been replaced by something steadier. I was no longer waiting for Thomas to reveal the truth. I was quietly preparing for the day when he would discover that I already knew far more than he had ever imagined. 3 days after Thomas returned from Denver, he mentioned that his company lawyer had scheduled a meeting the following Friday to review several retirement planning documents. He described it as a routine update that every executive nearing retirement should complete. His tone was casual, almost rehearsed, and he suggested we both attend because some of the paperwork involved our shared estate. I smiled, marked the appointment on my calendar, and thanked him for remembering to include me. Inside, I recognized the quiet importance of the invitation. Patricia Monroe had already explained that meetings involving financial planning often revealed far more than the documents themselves. The week passed peacefully. We attended church on Sunday, shared dinner with our daughter and grandchildren on Tuesday, and spent Wednesday evening watching an old movie we had both loved for years. Thomas laughed at familiar scenes exactly as he always had. Looking across the living room, I briefly wondered whether he ever remembered the promises we had exchanged when we were young. Perhaps he did. Perhaps people simply become skilled at placing different versions of themselves into different parts of their lives. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting in from Puget Sound. We drove downtown together, making small talk about traffic and weekend plans. Thomas even reached across the center console and gently squeezed my hand while we waited at a red light. I returned the gesture without hesitation. Calm had become my greatest strength because it allowed me to see everything without allowing emotion to cloud my judgment. The law office occupied the top floor of a modern building overlooking Elliott Bay. Large windows filled the conference room with natural light, and a neatly organized folder rested in front of each chair. Thomas greeted the attorney warmly, clearly comfortable in the surroundings. Patricia had encouraged me not to be surprised if confidence disappeared the moment facts entered the conversation. I remembered her advice as we took our seats. The attorney began by reviewing several standard documents before asking whether both of us understood our current financial records and estate planning arrangements. Thomas answered confidently that everything had already been discussed between us. Before I could speak, another folder was placed gently in front of me. Inside were copies of financial summaries, property information, and several records I had already reviewed during my meetings with Patricia. Nothing in those papers shocked me anymore because I had prepared carefully. Thomas, however, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the discussion shifted from assumptions to documentation. Questions about travel expenses, account activity, and long-term financial planning required precise answers rather than polished explanations. For the first time in many weeks, silence settled over him. I did not interrupt. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply opened my own notebook and placed it beside the documents already on the table. It contained dates, locations, travel schedules, and observations written over many quiet evenings. Nothing emotional. Nothing exaggerated. Only carefully recorded facts that matched the records now being discussed. Thomas looked toward me with an expression I had not seen before. It was not anger. It was surprise. He had expected confusion, perhaps even confrontation. Instead, he found preparation. He slowly realized that while he had been carefully protecting his version of the truth, I had quietly been protecting my ability to recognize the real one. The meeting ended with several follow-up appointments scheduled for the weeks ahead. As we walked back toward the parking garage, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt honest. For months, Thomas had believed he was controlling every conversation through carefully chosen words. He still did not understand that words had stopped guiding my decisions the moment I stepped into that Chicago hotel. Since then, every choice I had made had been built upon something far stronger than promises. It had been built upon patience, preparation, and the quiet confidence that truth never needs to raise its voice to be heard. Nearly a year has passed since that meeting overlooking Elliott Bay, and when I think back to the woman who stepped into that Chicago hotel, I almost feel as though I am remembering someone else. I believed that discovering the truth would destroy me. Instead, it quietly introduced me to the strongest version of myself I had ever known. The months that followed were never loud or dramatic. Every important conversation happened with dignity, every decision rested on verified facts, and every legal step was handled respectfully. Thomas and I eventually accepted that our lives were moving in different directions. There were no bitter public arguments and no scenes designed to embarrass anyone. Some stories do not need raised voices because the truth already speaks clearly enough. Friends occasionally asked how I had remained so calm through such a difficult season. My answer was always the same. Panic changes nothing. Preparation changes everything. Looking back, I realized the greatest mistake I ever made was believing that trust meant ignoring my own instincts. Real trust is built on honesty from both people. The moment honesty disappears, silence becomes far more dangerous than any difficult conversation. I still live in Seattle, although my days look very different now. I continue volunteering with the charitable foundation that first brought me to Chicago. I joined a community gardening program, began traveling with friends instead of postponing every trip for someone else's schedule, and finally enrolled in the watercolor classes I had delayed for years because life always seemed too busy. My home feels peaceful again. Not because everything turned out exactly as I once imagined, but because nothing inside these walls depends on uncertainty anymore. Every photograph I chose to keep reminds me of a chapter that was real when it happened. I no longer feel the need to erase my past in order to appreciate my future. One autumn afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Patricia Monroe. It simply congratulated me for handling an incredibly difficult chapter with grace, and wished me happiness in the years ahead. I placed that note inside the same notebook that had begun with dates, flight numbers, and quiet observations. As I turned its pages, I noticed how the handwriting changed from uncertain lines into steady, confident sentences. The notebook had never really been about documenting another person's choices. It had become the record of my own transformation. Sometimes people ask whether I regret walking into that hotel on that rainy afternoon. My answer surprises them. I do not. If I had arrived 5 minutes later, I might have spent years believing stories that were never true. That unexpected moment gave me something far more valuable than comfort. It gave me clarity. And clarity has a remarkable way of restoring peace. I no longer measure my life by the years I lost believing someone else's promises. I measure it by the days I gained after believing my own judgment again. Every morning when I open my curtains and sunlight fills the living room, I remember that strength rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly through small decisions made with patience, honesty, and self-respect. The greatest victory was never proving that Thomas had been dishonest. The greatest victory was refusing to let another person's choices determine the rest of my life. The woman who once stood hidden behind a bouquet of white lilies in a hotel lobby believed she had reached the end of her story. She was wrong. That day was simply the first page of a new chapter, one that finally belonged entirely to me.